When it comes to the conflicting viewpoints passage on the ACT science section, you want to do a couple things when you're reading it. When you read, you want to figure out how the arguments are similar to each other and to figure out how the arguments are different from each other. I also want to point out a couple things in this passage. Scientist 1 argues that the first birds evolved from theropods, and Scientist 2 directly responds to that by saying birds are not theropods because theropods lived only on the ground. And then Scientist 1 says that they shared 23 skeletal features identical with their ancestors. And again, Scientist 2 directly responds to that by saying that these skeletal features are similar only because they lived in a similar habitat. So in this case, one scientist is actually directly responding to the other scientist. So let's look at number 11. It says that consider Scientist 2 statements about why theropods could not be the ancestors of birds. Well, Scientist 2 says that birds are not theropods because theropods lived only on the ground. So if we want to contradict that statement, we want to show how they aren't on the ground. And the only one that does that is C, by showing that they climb trees. Number 12, both scientists would disagree with the statement that birds existed how many millions of years ago? Well, Scientist 1 says that this happened 150 million years ago. Scientist 2 says this happened 220 million years ago. The only one that falls outside that range is J, 250 million years ago. 13, Scientist 1, but not Scientist 2, describes a fossil that provides evidence of a possible bird ancestor. That, well, Scientist 1 says that 250 million years ago, a fossil showed feathers and shoulders like wings. And the only one that matches that is B, covered in feathers. A, C, and D actually only show up in Scientist 2's argument. 14. Fossils of Geolornis are considered very unusual because they show a characteristic of early birds that is rarely fossilized. Well, if you think about fossilization, what lasts after being caked in dirt and soil and clay and all those things? Well, it's usually the solid structures. Well, claws, beaks, and leg bones are typically solid, whereas feathers are things that can fall off and decompose. So the correct answer there is J. 15. By discussing the elongated scales indicated by the 230 million year old Archosaur fossil, Scientist 2 is most likely implying which of the following? Well, Scientist 2's argument is that the birds evolved from the Archosaur, so it would likely follow that the scales eventually evolved into something similar to feathers. So the correct answer choice is C. Now you want to be careful with number 15 because C and D look almost identical to each other, but the change from into from makes C and D opposite answer choices. So make sure you're careful when you see similar answer choices like that. Number 16. Suppose further fossil evidence reveals that the digits on the feet of theropods actually correspond to the second, third, and fourth digits instead of the first, second, and third digits on the feet of earlier reptiles. This discovery would better support the viewpoint of which scientist? Well, only Scientist 2 mentions the toes, and Scientist 2 says that theropods share the first, second, and third toes in common. Well, if that's the case, discovering that the digits were actually on the second, third, and fourth digits, that would weaken Scientist 2's argument. So, furthermore, it would support Scientist 1's argument. So the correct answer is G. And number 17. Theropods are thought to have been endothermic, whereas archosaurs are thought to have been ectothermic. This information supports the viewpoint of which scientist? So endothermic is just a fancy way of saying warm-blooded, and ectothermic is a fancy way of saying cold-blooded. Well, if you think back to elementary school, you learned that birds are warm-blooded creatures. So this information would support the viewpoint of Scientist 1 because birds are endothermic or birds are warm-blooded.